Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something truly special. We're about to embark on a journey through history's most spectacularly ridiculous deaths. The kind of exits that make you wonder if the universe has a sense of humor, and spoiler alert, it absolutely does. This is a collection of true stories about real people who managed to shuffle off this mortal coil in ways so absurd that centuries later, we're still trying to figure out how natural selection let them live long enough to become historical footnotes. So before we begin this morbidly entertaining adventure, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy diving into the darker corners of human stupidity with me. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. There's something beautifully ironic about people from around the world gathering together to laugh at death, which our ancestors would probably find either heartwarming or deeply disturbing. Now, grab your favorite beverage, dim the lights, maybe light a candle for ambience. Though given what we're about to discuss, perhaps avoid open flames, and let's settle in together for tonight's exploration of cosmic comedy. So, you think you understand how ridiculous human beings can be when faced with mortality? Oh, you sweet, innocent soul, like a philosophy student thinking they figured out the meaning of life after one semester. You have absolutely no idea what we're about to uncover. We're talking about emperors killed by doorframes, philosophers suffocated by appreciation, and kings murdered by fruit. We're exploring deaths so monumentally stupid that they transcend mere tragedy and enter the realm of performance art. These aren't your typical historical figures who died heroically in battle or peacefully in their sleep. No, these are the special ones, the individuals who managed to exit existence in ways so creatively incompetent that death itself probably paused for a moment to say, really? That's how you want to go out. Tonight, we're going to meet people who prove that intelligence, wealth, power, and talent are absolutely no protection against the fundamental absurdity of being human. We'll discover that throughout history, the Grim Reaper has occasionally shown up wearing a comedy mask, armed with banana peels and whoopee cushions instead of the traditional scythe. So buckle up, because we're about to take a tour through time's greatest hits of human foolishness, where every story ends the same way, but the journey there is so magnificently ridiculous that you'll question everything you thought you knew about dignity, common sense, and the basic requirements for staying alive. Death, they say, is the great equalizer. Rich or poor, king or peasant, genius or fool, we all shuffle off this mortal coil eventually. But here's the thing nobody mentions in those somber funeral eulogies. Sometimes the Grim Reaper shows up with a whoopee cushion and a rubber chicken. Sometimes death doesn't come riding a pale horse, but rather trips over its own scythe and lands face first in cosmic absurdity. Throughout history, while most people have had the courtesy to die in predictably boring ways, disease, old age, war, a select few have managed to exit this world with such spectacular foolishness that their deaths become legend. Not the heroic kind of legend, mind you. The kind where future generations read about it and think, how did natural selection let this person live long enough to reproduce? Let's start with Emperor Caligula, a man so delightfully unhinged that historians still argue whether he was genuinely insane or just really committed to performance art. This was a fellow who declared war on Neptune, ordered his soldiers to attack the ocean, and then commanded them to collect seashells as spoils of war. He made his horse a consul, not metaphorically. Literally gave his horse a government position with voting privileges. The horse probably made better policy decisions than most senators, but that's another story. Now, Caligula's death wasn't particularly funny in itself. He was stabbed by his own guards, which is fairly standard emperor removal procedure. But the circumstances leading up to it, pure comedy gold. The man had become so paranoid and erratic that he started executing people for sneezing in his presence, convinced they were mocking his bald head. He would force senators to run alongside his chariot for miles, just because he enjoyed watching old men wheeze. The final straw came when he announced his intention to move to Egypt and be worshipped as a god. His guards, exhausted by the endless stream of ridiculous edicts, decided they'd had enough. One moment he was planning his divine coronation, the next he was bleeding out in a palace tunnel, probably wondering why his divine powers weren't kicking in. But if you want genuine slapstick death, let's talk about Draco, the ancient Greek lawgiver whose name gave us the word draconian. This was a man who believed that stealing a cabbage should be punishable by death. Jaywalking, death. Looking at him funny, death. Not laughing at his jokes, believe it or not, death. He created a legal system so harsh that people said his laws were written in blood, not ink. The beautiful irony of Draco's demise is that he was killed by success, or rather, by the ancient Greek equivalent of a standing ovation. You see, in those days, showing appreciation for a speaker involved throwing your cloak at them. It was like giving someone flowers, except with more fabric and less fragrance. Draco had just finished delivering what was apparently a particularly rousing speech about the virtues of excessive punishment when the crowd, overwhelmed by enthusiasm, began hurling their cloaks at him with gusto. Now, 1 cloak is manageable, 10 cloaks might be cumbersome. But when an entire amphitheatre's worth of admirers simultaneously launches their winter wear at you, you're looking at a textile avalanche. Poor Draco disappeared under a mountain of woolen appreciation, suffocating beneath the very garments meant to honor him. He who lived by extreme measures died by extreme appreciation. The man who made everything a capital offense became a victim of capital enthusiasm. Picture the scene. Hundreds of Greek citizens, beaming with pride, watching their beloved lawgiver vanish beneath a growing pile of cloaks like some sort of murderous laundry mountain. By the time they realized what was happening and started digging him out, it was too late. Draco had been loved to death, literally smothered by admiration. If that's not cosmic justice, what is? Moving forward in time, let's visit medieval Europe, where stupidity and nobility often went hand in hand like a perfectly matched pair of silk gloves. Take King John of England, a monarch so spectacularly inept that his own barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta, just to limit the damage he could do. This was a man who managed to lose the crown jewels in a bog and spent most of his reign hiding from his own subjects. John's death, while not immediately hilarious, becomes funnier when you consider the circumstances. He was travelling through East Anglia when he decided to take a shortcut across the Well Stream, a tidal estuary known for its unpredictable waters and quicksand-like conditions. His advisors, the few who hadn't fled or been executed, warned him against it. The locals told him to wait for low tide. Even his horse seemed reluctant. But John, with the confidence of a man who had never let reality interfere with his decision-making, decided he knew better than everyone else. He pressed forward, and predictably, his entire baggage train got swallowed by the estuary. All the crown jewels, gone. The royal treasury, underwater. Priceless artifacts accumulated over generations of English royalty, now permanent residents of a muddy bog. John himself made it across, but the shock and stress of losing everything apparently gave him such violent dysentery that he died a few days later, possibly from eating too many peaches while his digestive system was already in rebellion. So technically, King John was killed by fruit, making him perhaps the only monarch in history to be assassinated by produce. His last words were reportedly complaints about his stomach troubles, which seems appropriate for a man who spent his entire reign making poor digestive decisions on behalf of an entire kingdom. But medieval Europe wasn't done producing entertainingly doomed royalty. Enter Charles I of France, a man who proved that you can conquer Italy but still be defeated by a doorframe. Charles was actually a fairly competent king by medieval standards. He successfully invaded Italy, managed not to bankrupt France, and generally avoided starting any unnecessary wars with England, which was considered exceptional restraint for a French monarch. His downfall came at Chateau d'Amboise in 1498. Charles was on his way to watch a tennis match, because apparently, even in the 15th century, royalty enjoyed watching people hit balls back and forth. He was walking through a gallery that he had traversed hundreds of times before when he decided to engage in conversation with his companions while walking. Multitasking, medieval style. As they chatted about whatever it is French kings discussed, probably wine or the disappointing quality of recent peasant revolts, Charles failed to notice that the gallery ceiling was significantly lower than usual. He was a tall man, which was unusual for the period and generally considered a royal advantage. Unfortunately, on this particular day, his height became a liability. He struck his head on a stone lintel with such force that witnesses heard the impact from across the room. The sound was described as similar to a melon hitting pavement, which gives you an idea of both the force involved and the medieval approach to medical observation. Charles collapsed immediately, never regained consciousness, and died 9 hours later. Think about this: a man who had successfully led armies across the Alps, negotiated complex international treaties, and survived countless battles, was ultimately defeated by architecture. He conquered Italian city-states but was vanquished by a doorway. The King of France, brought low by a static piece of masonry that had been in exactly the same place for decades. The tennis match, incidentally, was postponed indefinitely. Speaking of death by environmental hazard, let's discuss Aeschylus, one of ancient Greece's greatest tragedians and the father of dramatic theatre. This was a man who had fought at Marathon and Salamis, survived multiple military campaigns, and created some of the most enduring works in Western literature. He understood irony better than almost anyone who ever lived, having practically invented dramatic irony as a literary device, which makes his death so beautifully appropriate that, if he had written it himself, critics would have called it too heavy-handed. Aeschylus had been told by an oracle that he would die when something fell on him from the sky. Being a sensible man who had seen enough oracular predictions come true in unpleasant ways, he took to spending most of his time outdoors, away from buildings, trees, or anything else that might potentially collapse on him. He figured that as long as he avoided structural hazards, he'd be safe from falling objects. What he failed to consider was the dietary habits of large birds. An eagle, soaring high above with a turtle in its talons, spotted what it thought was a rock below. Eagles, you see, have developed the clever strategy of dropping hard, shelled prey onto rocks to crack them open. It's an efficient system that has worked well for thousands of years. The eagle released its turtle, aiming for what appeared to be a promising boulder. The boulder was Aeschylus's bald head. The turtle, plummeting from a considerable height, struck the playwright with enough force to kill him instantly. Aeschylus, master of dramatic timing and poetic justice, was killed by a confused raptor with poor depth perception. The man who wrote about the inexorable workings of fate became its victim in the most absurdly literal way possible. The eagle, presumably, flew away disappointed. The turtle also died, making this one of history's few triple tragedies: playwright dead, turtle dead, eagle confused and still hungry. What makes this even more perfect is that Aeschylus spent his final years specifically trying to avoid death by falling objects, only to be killed by a falling object delivered by a creature he never thought to worry about. It's as if the universe was making a very elaborate joke about the limits of human foresight. From ancient Greece, let's leap to 16th century Denmark and meet Tycho Brahe, one of history's greatest astronomers, and a man who proved that scientific genius and social awkwardness can be a deadly combination. Brahe was the sort of person who today would probably spend all his time on internet forums arguing about star catalogues and correcting other people's measurements. In the 16th century, he had to content himself with being incredibly pedantic about planetary observations. Brahe had already lived through one absurd near-death experience in his youth when he lost part of his nose in a duel over a mathematical disagreement. Because apparently, in Denmark, arguing about math was serious enough to warrant sword combat. He wore a prosthetic nose made of gold and silver for the rest of his life, which must have made sneezing an expensive proposition. But his death was even more ridiculous than his disfigurement. In 1601, Brahe attended a banquet in Prague hosted by Baron Peter Vogt von Rosenberg. This was the kind of formal dinner where you couldn't just get up and use the bathroom whenever nature called. Etiquette demanded that you wait for the host to signal an appropriate break in the proceedings. Brahe, who had apparently consumed a considerable amount of beer during the meal, found himself in increasing discomfort as the evening wore on. But he was a man of rigid social propriety. He would not commit the breach of etiquette involved in leaving the table before permission was granted. So he sat there, stoically enduring what must have been an increasingly urgent biological situation, waiting for Baron von Rosenberg to indicate that guests could take a comfort break. The break never came, or rather, it came too late. By the time Brahe was finally able to relieve himself, His bladder had been overstretched for so long that he had developed what modern medicine would recognize as acute urinary retention. His bladder became infected. The infection spread to his kidneys, and within 11 days, one of Europe's most accomplished astronomers was dead. Tycho Brahe, the man who accurately charted the positions of over 777 stars, who built the most sophisticated astronomical instruments of his age, who revolutionized our understanding of planetary motion, was killed by politeness. He died because he was too well mannered to excuse himself from dinner. His last words were reportedly, "Let me not seem to have lived in vain," which suggests that even in his final moments, he was worried about the cosmic implications of dying from bladder complications at a dinner party. From the scientific community, let's move to the artistic world and examine the demise of Jean-Baptiste Lully, court composer to Louis XIV, and a man who proved that musicians can be just as prone to spectacularly stupid deaths as anyone else. Lully was conducting a Te Deum in 1687 to celebrate the king's recovery from illness. This was the Baroque equivalent of a wellness concert, all uplifting music and gratitude to divine providence. In those days, conductors didn't use the small, lightweight batons we're familiar with today. Instead, they used a heavy staff, essentially a walking stick, which they would pound on the ground to keep time. It was called a conducting staff, and it was about as subtle as a medieval mace. Lully was really getting into the music, pounding out the rhythm with his usual enthusiasm, when in a moment of particular musical passion, he brought the staff down too forcefully and missed the floor entirely. Instead, he drove the pointed end directly into his foot, piercing it completely. Now, a sensible person might have sought immediate medical attention. Lully, however, was not a sensible person. He was an artist, which means he had different priorities than normal humans. The show must go on, he declared, and he continued conducting with a bleeding foot, probably leaving a small puddle of composer blood on the concert hall floor. The wound became infected, as wounds tend to do when you ignore them and continue dancing around in 17th century footwear. Gangrene set in. Doctors recommended amputation, but Lully refused, claiming that he needed both feet to dance. This was a reasonable concern for a man whose livelihood depended on choreographed movement, but less reasonable when the alternative was death. The gangrene spread, and within a few months, Lully was dead, killed by his own conducting staff and an absolute refusal to accept that sometimes artistic integrity has to take a back seat to basic medical common sense. What makes this particularly absurd is that Lully was conducting a piece celebrating the king's recovery from illness. He was literally directing music about healing, while simultaneously dying from a self-inflicted wound that he refused to let heal. The irony was so thick you could have conducted it with a staff. Let's continue our journey through time and visit the American West, where natural selection worked overtime and often with a sense of humor. Consider the case of Elmer McCurdy, a man who managed to turn his own death into a decades-long comedy of errors that wouldn't end even after he died. McCurdy was what you might generously call a career criminal, though career implies a certain level of professional competence that McCurdy never achieved. He specialized in train robberies, which sounds exciting and romantic until you realize that McCurdy was spectacularly bad at it. His first attempted train robbery netted him exactly 46, and that was his most successful heist. In 1911, McCurdy decided to rob what he thought was a passenger train carrying a safe full of money. He spent weeks planning this heist, gathering intelligence, studying train schedules, and preparing for what he was sure would be his big score. Unfortunately, McCurdy had robbed the wrong train. Instead of a passenger train with a safe full of cash, he had held up a freight train carrying grain. His total haul from this elaborate caper was exactly 46 worth of corn liquor and $2 in loose change. Even by the standards of incompetent criminals, this was impressively pathetic. But McCurdy's death is where things get really interesting. A few days after his failed grain heist, he was tracked down by a sheriff's posse and took refuge in a barn. Surrounded and outgunned, McCurdy decided to make his last stand. He grabbed a rifle and prepared to go down fighting, which was probably the most competent thing he had ever attempted. Unfortunately, McCurdy was no better at dramatic last stands than he was at train robbery. As he raised his rifle to fire at the approaching lawman, the gun exploded in his hands, killing him instantly. The weapon was so old and poorly maintained that it couldn't handle the stress of being fired, making McCurdy possibly the only outlaw in history to be killed by his own incompetence and substandard equipment maintenance. But death was just the beginning of McCurdy's comedy career. The local undertaker embalmed his body and put it on display, charging people 5 cents to see the bandit who wouldn't give up. For years, McCurdy's corpse toured the country as a carnival attraction, billed as various famous outlaws and historical figures. Eventually, people forgot that it was a real corpse, and McCurdy's body ended up as a prop in various haunted houses and amusement parks. For decades, his mummified remains were handled by carnival workers who thought they were moving around a particularly well-made dummy. The truth was finally discovered in 1976 when a crew filming The $6 Million Man was setting up a scene in a funhouse. One of McCurdy's arms broke off, revealing human bone and tissue. DNA testing confirmed that the prop was actually the mummified remains of Elmer McCurdy, still traveling the country more than 60 years after his death. McCurdy, who never successfully completed a crime while alive, had inadvertently become the most successful touring attraction in American entertainment history. His posthumous career lasted longer and was more profitable than anything he ever accomplished while breathing. Sticking with America, but jumping forward to the 20th century, we encounter Gary Hoy, a lawyer who demonstrated that confidence can be more dangerous than ignorance. Hoy worked for a prestigious Toronto law firm and was known for his dramatic presentations and his absolute faith in modern engineering. On July 9, 1993, Hoy was giving a group of articling students a tour of the firm's offices on the 24th floor of the Toronto Dominion Centre. He wanted to demonstrate the strength of the building's windows, which were indeed quite robust, designed to withstand high winds and the occasional bird strike. Hoy's preferred method of demonstration was to hurl himself against the glass, bouncing off dramatically while explaining the advanced engineering principles involved. He had performed this stunt numerous times before, always with the same result: the window held, Hoy bounced off, and everyone was suitably impressed by modern construction techniques. On this particular day, in front of a group of new law students, Hoy decided to really sell the demonstration. He took a running start and threw himself against the window with more force than usual, eager to make a memorable impression on the young lawyers. The window held, just as it was designed to do. Unfortunately, the window frame did not. The entire window, intact and unbroken, popped out of its frame and fell 24 stories to the street below, taking Gary Hoy with it. The students watched in horror as their tour guide disappeared through what had been a perfectly good window just moments before. Hoy died instantly upon impact, still presumably confident in the engineering principles he had been demonstrating. The window, ironically, remained unbroken throughout the fall and was found intact on the sidewalk next to Hoy's body. He had been absolutely correct about the strength of the glass. He simply hadn't considered the reliability of the mounting system. The incident won Hoy a posthumous Darwin Award and fundamentally changed the way law firms conduct office tours. It also led to significant improvements in window installation standards, making Gary Hoy perhaps the only lawyer in history whose death directly contributed to advances in building safety. From modern professional disasters, let's return to ancient times and visit Rome during the reign of Emperor Claudius, specifically to discuss the death of his wife Messalina, a woman who turned adultery into performance art and political protest into bedroom farce. Messalina wasn't just unfaithful to her husband, she was creatively, aggressively, almost competitively unfaithful. She once challenged Rome's most famous prostitute to a contest to see who could sleep with more men in a single night. Messalina won, which was either a triumph of imperial stamina or a devastating commentary on the state of Roman marriage. But Messalina's masterpiece of marital betrayal came in 48 AD, when she decided to marry her lover Gaius Silius in a public ceremony while still married to the emperor. Not a secret wedding, not a discreet affair, but a full-blown public celebration complete with wedding guests, ceremonial rituals, and probably a very confused wedding planner. This wasn't just adultery, it was adultery with a parade permit. The plan, apparently, was to overthrow Claudius and install Silius as emperor, making Messalina the new empress through her second marriage. It was a coup disguised as a wedding. or possibly a wedding disguised as a coup. Either way, it demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of how imperial politics worked. Claudius, who was not known for his quick wit or decisive action, was initially so baffled by the situation that he didn't know how to respond. His advisors had to explain to him several times that yes, his wife had married someone else, and yes, this was probably treasonous, and yes, he should probably do something about it. By the time Claudius finally grasped the situation and ordered arrests, Messalina had realized that her wedding might not have been the brilliant strategy she had imagined. She attempted to flee but was caught in the gardens she had designed for her various romantic rendezvous. The soldiers sent to arrest her found her hiding among the very rose bushes where she had entertained countless lovers. She was executed on the spot, killed while literally surrounded by the flowers she had used to set the mood for her extramarital adventures. Messalina died as she had lived dramatically, inappropriately, and in a garden. Her death was poetic justice delivered with horticultural irony. From Roman political theatre, let's move to medieval France and examine the death of King Louis XIII, a monarch who proved that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is your own wardrobe. Louis was actually a competent king by medieval standards, successful in war, reasonably effective at administration, and generally capable of keeping both his nobles and his peasants from open rebellion. His downfall came during a particularly hot summer day in 1180 when he decided to go hunting. Medieval hunting wasn't the casual weekend activity we might imagine today. It was an elaborate social ritual involving dozens of courtiers, hundreds of servants, and enough equipment to supply a small army. Louis, determined to look appropriately regal for the occasion, chose to wear his finest hunting outfit, a heavy velvet tunic lined with ermine, leather breeches reinforced with metal studs, and a magnificent fur-trimmed cloak that probably cost more than most people's houses. The problem was that it was an exceptionally hot day, the kind of weather that makes wearing multiple layers of heavy fabric and fur feel like being slowly cooked inside a very expensive oven. But Louis was a king, and kings didn't make wardrobe adjustments based on mere weather conditions. As the hunting party rode through the forest, Louis began to overheat dramatically. His courtiers noticed that he was sweating profusely, breathing heavily, and occasionally swaying in his saddle, but nobody wanted to suggest that perhaps His Royal Majesty might want to remove his ermine-lined cloak. Medieval court etiquette was very specific about not offering unsolicited advice to monarchs, especially advice that implied they had made poor fashion choices. Louis collapsed from heat exhaustion in the middle of the forest, surrounded by dozens of people who had watched him slowly cooking himself in royal finery without saying a word. He never regained consciousness, dying a few days later from what modern medicine would recognize as heat stroke complicated by dehydration. The King of France, victor in multiple military campaigns, survivor of political intrigue and foreign invasions, was killed by his own outfit. He died because he was too proud to dress appropriately for the weather, making him possibly the only monarch in history to be assassinated by his own fashion sense. The hunting trip, needless to say, was cancelled. Let's venture into 18th century England and meet Francis Bacon, the philosopher and scientist who helped establish the scientific method and was one of the founding fathers of empirical observation. Bacon believed that knowledge should be gained through direct experience rather than abstract reasoning, which makes his death a perfect example of scientific irony. In March 1626, Bacon was travelling through North London when he was struck by a sudden scientific inspiration. He had been pondering the preservation of meat, wondering whether cold temperatures might slow the process of decay. This was actually a very advanced idea for the time. Refrigeration wouldn't be invented for another 2 centuries. Bacon decided that the best way to test his hypothesis was through immediate experimentation. He stopped his carriage, purchased a chicken from a nearby vendor, and began stuffing the bird with snow, testing whether the cold would preserve the meat better than traditional methods. This was empirical science at its most direct. See a problem, form a hypothesis, tested immediately using whatever materials are available. Bacon stood in the snow for over an hour, methodically packing his experimental chicken while making careful observations about the preservation process. Unfortunately, while Bacon was focused on the scientific implications of his frozen poultry experiment. He failed to notice that he himself was being preserved by the same cold temperatures he was studying. By the time he finished his observations, he was thoroughly chilled and had developed what would quickly become a fatal case of pneumonia. Bacon died a few days later, killed by the very scientific curiosity that had made him famous. He had discovered the principles of refrigeration through direct experimentation, but the cost of this discovery was his own life. The man who promoted learning through experience learned the hard way that standing in snow for extended periods is dangerous to your health. The chicken, according to contemporary accounts, was perfectly preserved and remained edible for weeks. Bacon's experiment was a complete scientific success, which probably would have pleased him more than the fact that it killed him. From scientific martyrdom, let's move to 19th century America and visit the world of competitive eating, where we'll meet a man known only as Big Bill, who proved that even recreational activities can become unexpectedly lethal when pursued with sufficient enthusiasm. Big Bill was a professional competitive eater, back when this was a legitimate carnival profession rather than a televised sport. He travelled from town to town, challenging locals to eating contests and usually winning through a combination of natural talent and carefully developed technique. His specialty was pie eating contests, and he was renowned throughout the Midwest for his ability to consume entire pies in record time, while maintaining what witnesses described as surprising dignity for a man with his face covered in fruit filling. In 1887, Big Bill arrived in a small Missouri town during their annual harvest festival. The local organizers, eager to provide entertainment that would draw crowds from neighboring towns, arranged for what they billed as the ultimate pie eating challenge. Big Bill versus 5 local champions, with the winner determined by who could eat the most pies in 30 minutes. The pies were magnificent specimens of American baking: apple, cherry, pumpkin, peach, and blueberry, each one the size of a wagon wheel and baked by the town's most accomplished cooks. This wasn't just a contest, it was a celebration of agricultural abundance and regional pride, expressed through competitive consumption. Big Bill approached the challenge with his usual confidence and systematic technique. He had developed what he called a spiral method, starting from the outside of each pie and working his way toward the center in a carefully calculated pattern that maximized efficiency while minimizing the risk of choking. For the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Big Bill maintained his steady pace while his local competitors fell by the wayside one by one, defeated by their own enthusiasm and inadequate preparation. By the 20-minute mark, Big Bill had finished 4 complete pies and was working on his 5th, while his nearest competitor was still struggling with his 3rd. The crowd was cheering. The local newspaper reporter was taking notes, and Big Bill was approaching what would have been a new personal record when disaster struck in the form of overconfidence. With 5 minutes remaining, Big Bill decided to attempt what he called his finishing move, instead of continuing with his methodical spiral technique. He would simply open his mouth as wide as possible and attempt to consume the remainder of his 5th pie in one enormous bite. It was a dramatic gesture designed to intimidate any future challengers and provide a spectacular conclusion to his performance. Unfortunately, Big Bill had miscalculated the size of the remaining pie slice. What he attempted to put in his mouth was roughly equivalent to trying to swallow a dinner plate covered in fruit and pastry. The pie lodged in his throat with such completeness that no amount of backslapping or water could dislodge it. Big Bill died within minutes, suffocated by his own ambition and a perfectly baked apple pie. His final expression, according to witnesses, suggested that he was surprised by this turn of events, but not entirely disappointed with his performance up to that point. The contest was declared null and void, though Big Bill was posthumously recognized as having achieved a new regional record for pie consumption, a title he held until his death record was surpassed by safety regulations that prevented similar contests from taking place. From competitive eating, let's move to competitive dying and examine the case of Chrysippus, an ancient Greek philosopher who belongs to the Stoic school and who proved that even philosophical wisdom has its limits when confronted with sufficient absurdity. Chrysippus was one of the most important Stoic philosophers, known for his logical rigor and his ability to remain calm in the face of life's inevitable challenges. He taught that the wise person accepts whatever fate brings with equanimity, finding peace through understanding that external events are beyond our control. This philosophical approach served him well throughout a long and productive life. He wrote over 700 works, established many of the fundamental principles of Stoic logic, and was widely regarded as one of the most intellectually rigorous thinkers of his generation. Chrysippus had achieved the kind of philosophical serenity that lesser mortals could only aspire to. His death, however, suggests that there are limits to even the most disciplined philosophical composure. In 206 BC, Chrysippus was attending a religious festival in Athens. He had been drinking wine, which wasn't unusual. Even Stoic philosophers enjoyed the occasional celebration. During the festivities, he witnessed something so absurd that it completely overwhelmed his carefully cultivated philosophical detachment. A donkey had wandered into the temple area and was eating the figs that had been offered to the gods. This wasn't particularly shocking. Donkeys eat figs, and temple security in ancient Athens was apparently not very rigorous. But what happened next transcended ordinary animal misbehavior. After finishing the figs, the donkey's owner appeared and, either out of religious devotion or possibly because he had also been drinking, began offering the animal wine to wash down its stolen fruit. The sight of a donkey being given wine as if it were a proper symposium guest struck Chrysippus as the funniest thing he had ever witnessed. The great philosopher, master of logical reasoning and emotional self-control, began laughing uncontrollably. This wasn't dignified philosophical amusement. It was deep, overwhelming, physically exhausting laughter. Chrysippus laughed so hard that he couldn't breathe. He laughed until his chest hurt, until tears streamed down his face, until his carefully maintained philosophical composure was completely abandoned. He laughed until he died. Chrysippus, who had spent his entire career teaching others how to maintain emotional equilibrium, was killed by his own sense of humor. The man who believed that wisdom lay in accepting life's absurdities with calm detachment was defeated by an absurdity so perfect that it destroyed his philosophical defenses entirely. The donkey, presumably, was unaware that it had just caused the death of one of antiquity's greatest thinkers, and continued enjoying its wine with the kind of simple contentment that Chrysippus had spent his life trying to achieve through complex philosophical reasoning. Let's move from ancient philosophy to medieval architecture and meet Master James of St. George, the most accomplished castle builder of his age, and a man who proved that professional expertise is no protection against spectacularly bad timing. James was the architect responsible for most of Edward I's Welsh castles, massive fortifications that still stand today as testaments to medieval engineering skill. He designed carefully Harlech Castle, and Beaumaris Castle, creating defensive structures so sophisticated that they influenced military architecture for centuries. Building castles in medieval Wales was dangerous work. You had to deal with hostile local populations, difficult terrain, unpredictable weather, and the constant possibility that someone would try to kill you before you could finish fortifying against them. James had survived decades of this work, successfully completing projects that lesser architects couldn't even imagine. In 1309, James was putting the finishing touches on Beaumaris Castle, his masterpiece of defensive design. The project had taken nearly 20 years to complete, and James was justifiably proud of what he had accomplished. Every wall, every tower, every arrow slit had been positioned with mathematical precision to create an impregnable fortress. On the day of the castle's official completion ceremony, James decided to personally inspect every element of his creation one final time. He climbed to the top of the highest tower to survey his life's work from the best possible vantage point. The view was spectacular. His perfectly proportioned castle spread out below, surrounded by the Welsh countryside that had tried for 2 decades to prevent its construction. James was so absorbed in admiring his architectural achievement that he failed to notice that the wooden scaffolding he was standing on was still temporary construction material, not permanent stonework. In his excitement to see the completed castle from above, he had climbed onto scaffolding that was scheduled to be removed that very day. As James stood there contemplating his masterpiece, The scaffolding crew began dismantling the wooden supports below him, unaware that the master architect was still standing on top of their work. By the time they realized their mistake, James was already falling. Master James of St. George, the man who had designed some of the strongest fortifications in medieval Europe, fell to his death from his own castle on the day of its completion. He who had spent his career creating structures that could withstand any assault was defeated by temporary wooden scaffolding that wasn't designed to withstand anything. The irony was noted by contemporary chroniclers who recorded that James died within sight of his greatest triumph, brought low by the very stones he had raised up. The castle he died building still stands today, which probably would have pleased him more than the manner of his death. From medieval craftsmanship, let's jump to the Renaissance and meet Pietro Aretino, a writer whose death proved that even literary genius can be defeated by inappropriate timing and uncontrollable laughter. Aretino was one of the most influential writers of his age, known for his satirical works, his erotic poetry, and his ability to make or destroy reputations through the power of his pen. He was called the Scourge of Princes, because even royalty feared his literary criticism. Popes and emperors sought his approval, and those who earned his disapproval often found their reputations destroyed by his devastating wit. In 1556, Aretino was dining with friends at his home in Venice, when conversation turned to his sister, who had recently become a nun. This was apparently a source of ongoing amusement to Aretino, who found the idea of his famously irreligious family producing a bride of Christ absolutely hilarious. One of his dinner companions made a particularly crude joke about nuns and religious devotion, the kind of humour that Aretino specialised in, but rarely heard directed at his own family. The joke was apparently so perfectly crafted and unexpectedly funny that Aretino was caught completely off guard. He began laughing with the kind of intensity usually reserve his most devastating literary attacks. But this wasn't the controlled wit of a professional satirist. It was uncontrolled, physical, overwhelming laughter. Aretino laughed so hard that he fell backward in his chair, still convulsing with mirth. Unfortunately, Aretino's dining room was on the second floor of his palazzo, and his chair was positioned near an open window that looked out over a canal. As he fell backward, still laughing about his sister's religious vocation, he went right through the window and plummeted into the water below. Pietro Aretino, master of satirical timing and deadly wit, drowned while laughing at a joke about nuns. The man who had destroyed careers with his pen was destroyed by his own sense of humour and poor furniture placement. His last moments were spent in the kind of uncontrolled mirth that he had spent his career inducing in others. Except this time the joke was literally on him. The dinner party, needless to say, ended abruptly, and Aretino's sister presumably said extra prayers for his soul, assuming she ever found out exactly how he died. From Renaissance literature, let's move to Enlightenment science and meet Georg Wilhelm Richmann, a German physicist who proved that scientific curiosity and electrical storms make a dangerous combination. Richmann was one of the leading electrical researchers of his time, working alongside Benjamin Franklin to understand the nature of lightning and electrical phenomena. He had built an elaborate laboratory in St. Petersburg dedicated to studying atmospheric electricity, complete with metal rods, measurement devices, and what he believed were adequate safety precautions. In August 1753, Richmann was conducting experiments with a device he called an electrical gnomon, essentially a metal rod connected to measuring equipment that was designed to capture and measure electrical charges from the atmosphere. It was cutting-edge scientific equipment for the time, based on Franklin's work with lightning rods, but adapted for laboratory measurement rather than practical protection. On the day of his death, a severe thunderstorm was approaching St. Petersburg, and Richmann saw this as a perfect opportunity to gather data about atmospheric electricity. He had invited a colleague, Ivan Sokolov, to witness his experiments and help record measurements. As the storm intensified, Richmann's equipment began registering increasingly strong electrical charges. This was exactly what he had hoped for. Finally, he would be able to measure the full power of atmospheric electricity under ideal conditions. He moved closer to his apparatus to get better readings, excited by the unprecedented data he was collecting. What Richmann failed to adequately consider was that his electrical gnomon was essentially a lightning rod connected directly to sensitive measuring equipment with no effective grounding system. He had created a device specifically designed to attract lightning and then positioned himself as close to it as possible during an active thunderstorm. A bolt of lightning struck the apparatus while Richman was leaning over it to check his measurements. The electrical charge passed through the equipment and into Richman, killing him instantly. The force was so great that it blew his shoes off and left a burn mark on his forehead in the shape of his measuring device. Sokolov, who was standing nearby, was knocked unconscious by the blast but survived to tell the story. When he regained consciousness, he found Richman dead, still holding his notebook. Apparently having taken measurements right up until the moment lightning killed him, Georg Wilhelm Richman became the first person in recorded history to be killed while conducting electrical experiments, earning him the distinction of being both a pioneer of electrical science and its first martyr. He died in pursuit of the very knowledge that might have prevented his death, making him a perfect example of scientific irony. His research notes, incidentally, provided valuable data about electrical phenomena and contributed significantly to the development of better lightning protection systems. Richman's death was scientifically useful, which probably would have pleased him more than the fact that it was completely avoidable. From electrical experimentation, let's move to musical performance and meet Jean-Marie Leclair, a French composer and violinist whose death proved that professional musicians face occupational hazards that have nothing to do with music. Leclair was one of the founders of the French violin school and composed some of the most technically demanding violin music of the Baroque period. He was a perfectionist who demanded exceptional skill from both himself and his students, which made him respected as a musician, but not necessarily beloved as a person. In 1764, Leclair was living in a small house in a rough neighborhood of Paris. Having spent most of his money on musical instruments and manuscript paper rather than comfortable accommodations, he had been working late into the night on a new violin concerto, trying to solve a particularly challenging passage that had been troubling him for weeks. The problem was that Leclair's house was in an area known for burglaries, and his habit of working late, with candles burning, made him an obvious target for thieves, who assumed that anyone awake at that hour must be counting money rather than composing music. On the night of October 22, 1764, a burglar broke into Leclair's house, expecting to find a wealthy merchant's cash box. Instead, he found a middle-aged man in a nightgown, surrounded by sheet music and holding a violin. The burglar, presumably confused by this unexpected scene, demanded that Leclair hand over his money. Leclair, who had been completely absorbed in his composition and may not have fully understood what was happening, responded by offering to play his latest piece for the intruder. This was either an attempt at bribery through musical entertainment or simply the reflexive response of a man whose entire life revolved around music. Either way, it was not what the burglar had expected or wanted to hear. The burglar, apparently uninterested in Baroque violin performance, stabbed Leclair and fled, leaving the composer bleeding to death among his manuscripts. Leclair died still clutching his violin, having offered his final performance to an audience of one who showed his appreciation by murdering the artist. Jean-Marie Leclair, master of musical timing and technical precision, was killed by someone who couldn't appreciate the finer points of violin composition. He died trying to share his art with a person who was interested only in stealing his possessions, making him possibly the only composer in history to be murdered while attempting an impromptu concert. The violin concerto he had been working on was found unfinished on his music stand, a few measures away from the breakthrough that had been eluding him for weeks. From musical martyrdom, let's return to political absurdity and examine the death of Pope John X era, a pontiff who proved that religious authority and personal responsibility don't always go hand in hand. John XI became pope in 955 at the age of 18, which should have been the first warning sign that this papacy might not go according to traditional expectations. He was more interested in hunting, gambling, and what medieval chroniclers diplomatically called carnal pleasures, than in spiritual leadership. Contemporary accounts describe John XI as treating the papal palace like a combination brothel and casino. He allegedly turned the Lateran Palace into what one chronicler called place of ill repute, where prostitutes and gamblers mingled with cardinals and visiting dignitaries. John VI's death in 964 was as undignified as his life had been inappropriate. According to the most reliable contemporary sources, he was in bed with a married woman when her husband arrived unexpectedly. The husband, discovering the Holy Father in a compromising position with his wife, became understandably upset about this breach of both marriage vows and papal dignity. What happened next depends on which chronicler you believe. Some accounts say the husband beat John Stephen to death with his bare hands. Others suggest that the Pope, attempting to escape through a window, fell and broke his neck. The most colourful version claims that John VI suffered a stroke while still in the act of adultery, struck down by divine justice at the moment of his greatest sin. Whatever the exact mechanism, Pope John VI died while engaged in behaviour that was about as far from papal conduct as possible. The Vicar of Christ, killed while violating the sanctity of marriage in what was supposed to be the holiest residence in Christendom. The papal court initially tried to cover up the circumstances of his death, claiming that he had died peacefully in his sleep after a brief illness. This fiction lasted approximately 1 day before the real story spread throughout Rome, making John XI's death scandal even more embarrassing than his living scandals had been. John XI was succeeded by Leo V, who spent most of his papacy trying to restore some dignity to the papal office and pretending that his predecessor had never existed. From papal impropriety, let's move to royal stupidity and meet King Alexander of Greece, a monarch who proved that sometimes the smallest enemies are the most dangerous. Alexander became king in 1917 after his father Constantine was forced to abdicate due to political pressure. He was never supposed to be a long-term ruler. He was meant to be a placeholder until the political situation stabilized and a more suitable candidate could be found. Alexander took his temporary status seriously and spent most of his reign trying to avoid making any decisions that might have lasting consequences. He was the kind of king who asked permission before changing the palace menu, which made him beloved by his advisors and completely ineffective as a monarch. In October 1920, Alexander was taking a walk in the royal gardens when he encountered 2 pet monkeys that belonged to the palace groundskeeper. These were small, presumably harmless animals that had been living peacefully on the palace grounds for years without causing any diplomatic incidents. For reasons that were never adequately explained, Alexander decided to intervene in what appeared to be a minor disagreement between the 2 monkeys. Perhaps he thought this was finally an opportunity to exercise some royal authority in a low-stakes situation. Or maybe he just felt sorry for whichever monkey seemed to be losing the argument. Alexander attempted to separate the fighting animals, which turned out to be a serious tactical error. Both monkeys immediately redirected their aggression toward the king, biting him repeatedly before he could escape. The bites themselves were relatively minor, but they became infected within a few days. This was 1920, before the discovery of antibiotics, so even small wounds could become life-threatening if bacteria entered the bloodstream. Alexander developed sepsis and died within 3 weeks, making him possibly the only monarch in history to be killed by pets during a diplomatic intervention. The King of Greece, brought down by palace monkeys in what was essentially a failed peacekeeping mission. His death had significant political consequences. Alexander's passing triggered a constitutional crisis, led to his father's restoration to the throne, and indirectly contributed to Greece's military defeat in the war with Turkey. 2 small monkeys had inadvertently altered the course of European history through their palace disagreement. The monkeys, incidentally, were quietly removed from the palace grounds and relocated to a zoo, where they presumably continued their disputes without international implications. From royal zoological disasters, let's explore the world of competitive athletics and meet Arichin of Phigailia, an ancient Greek wrestler who achieved victory and death simultaneously in what might be history's most Pyrrhic victory. Arichin was a champion in pankration, an ancient Olympic sport that combined wrestling and boxing with virtually no rules except that gouging and biting were discouraged. It was essentially mixed martial arts, but with less safety equipment and more olive oil. In 564 BC, Orichin was competing in his third Olympic pancration competition, attempting to win an unprecedented third consecutive championship. He was considered the greatest pancrationist of his generation, known for his technical skill and his ability to escape from seemingly impossible holds. During the championship match, Orichin found himself caught in a chokehold by his opponent, a younger and stronger wrestler who had clearly studied Orichin's previous matches and developed a strategy specifically designed to neutralize his escape techniques. The chokehold was perfectly applied and gradually tightening. Orichin was losing consciousness and had only seconds before he would either submit or pass out, ending his championship hopes and his perfect Olympic record. But Orichin had one last technique in his arsenal. As he felt consciousness slipping away, he managed to grab his opponent's foot and twist it with such force that he dislocated the man's ankle. The pain was so intense that his opponent immediately tapped out, signaling submission. The crowd erupted in celebration of Orichin's incredible comeback victory. He had won his third consecutive Olympic championship through pure determination and technical brilliance, snatching victory from the jaws of defeat in the most dramatic fashion possible. Unfortunately, Orichin was unable to enjoy his triumph. The chokehold had continued just long enough to kill him. By the time his opponent submitted, Orichin was already dead, still holding the ankle lock that had won him the match. The Olympic judges faced an unprecedented situation. They had a champion who had legitimately won his match, but was unable to accept his victory because he was dead. After considerable deliberation, they declared Orichin the official winner and awarded him the olive wreath posthumously. Orichin of Figalia became the only Olympic champion in history to win a gold medal while dead, achieving athletic immortality through the most literal interpretation possible. He had died as he lived, grappling with an opponent and refusing to give up. Even when giving up might have saved his life, his victory was celebrated throughout the Greek world as the ultimate example of athletic determination. Orichin had proved that winning was more important than surviving, which was either inspirational or deeply concerning, depending on your perspective on competitive sports. From ancient athletics, let's move to medieval entertainment and meet the unfortunate court jester known as Roland le Pétomène, a performer whose act was literally explosive and whose death proved that some talents are more dangerous than others. Roland was a professional flatulist, which was apparently a legitimate form of entertainment in medieval courts. His specialty was producing musical performances using controlled intestinal gas, a skill that required both natural talent and considerable practice. Roland could reportedly play simple melodies, imitate the sounds of various animals, and even produce sound effects to accompany storytelling. He was hired by nobles across France to provide entertainment at banquets and celebrations, making him one of history's most specialized performers. In 1204, Roland was performing for the court of Duke Philip of Burgundy, attempting to impress the nobility with his most ambitious routine, a musical interpretation of the Easter story, complete with sound effects representing angels, shepherds, and the resurrection itself. The performance was going exceptionally well. Roland had successfully depicted the Annunciation, the Nativity, and the Crucifixion through carefully controlled gastric acoustics. The audience was both entertained and amazed by his ability to create narrative through what was essentially biological sound effects. But when Roland attempted to represent the resurrection, the most climactic moment of his Easter performance, something went catastrophically wrong. Instead of the triumphant musical crescendo he had planned, Roland produced what witnesses described as sound like thunder, followed by immediate and obvious distress. Roland had apparently ruptured something internally while attempting his most ambitious performance. He collapsed immediately and died within minutes, killed by his own artistic ambition and the physical demands of his chosen profession. The court physician, examining the body, determined that Roland had essentially exploded from the inside while trying to produce a sound effect representing divine triumph. He had died in pursuit of the perfect performance, pushing his natural abilities beyond their anatomical limits. Roland le Pétomène became the first and possibly only professional flatulist in history to die while performing, earning him a place in the annals of both entertainment history and medical curiosity. His death marked the end of an era in medieval performance art, as subsequent entertainers were understandably reluctant to push the boundaries of gastric expression quite so aggressively. The Duke of Burgundy, reportedly, never hired another flatulist and switched to more conventional forms of court entertainment, such as juggling and lute music. From medieval performance art, let's jump to the Renaissance and examine the death of Girolamo Savonarola, a religious reformer who discovered that moral outrage can be a fatal character trait when directed at the wrong audience. Savonarola was a Dominican friar who became the de facto ruler of Florence in the 1490s through a combination of charismatic preaching and apocalyptic predictions. He convinced the Florentines that God was angry with their decadent lifestyle, and that only through moral purification could they avoid divine punishment. Under Savonarola's influence, Florence became a theocracy dedicated to destroying anything that might be considered sinful or corrupting. Citizens were encouraged to burn their vanities, books, artwork, jewelry, cosmetics, and anything else that might distract from spiritual contemplation. The culmination of this moral crusade was the Bonfire of the Vanities, in 1497, a massive public burning of art, books, and luxury goods in the centre of Florence. Paintings by Botticelli, manuscripts by classical authors, musical instruments, and mirrors were all consigned to the flames in a festival of cultural destruction. But Savonarola's moral enthusiasm eventually exceeded the tolerance of both his followers and the Pope. His sermons became increasingly extreme, his predictions more apocalyptic, and his demands for moral purity more unrealistic. He began claiming that he received direct visions from God, and that anyone who disagreed with him was an agent of Satan. In 1498, a Franciscan friar challenged Savonarola to prove his divine connection through trial by fire. The idea was that if Savonarola truly had God's protection, he would be able to walk through flames unharmed. If he was a fraud, the fire would expose him as such. This was essentially a medieval version of calling someone's bluff, except with potential immolation as the consequence of being wrong. Savonarola initially accepted the challenge, confident in his divine protection and eager to demonstrate his spiritual authority. But as the date of the trial approached, he began having second thoughts about the wisdom of testing God's protection through voluntary combustion. He started making excuses. The trial should be postponed due to weather. The wood wasn't properly blessed. His opponents weren't spiritually prepared for such a test. The Florentines, who had been expecting a spectacular demonstration of divine power, began to suspect that their spiritual leader might be less connected to the Almighty than he claimed. When Savonarola finally refused to participate in the trial by fire, public opinion turned against him immediately. The same people who had burned their possessions at his command now viewed him as a coward and a fraud. Within weeks, Savonarola was arrested, tortured into confessing that his visions were false, and condemned to death. On May 23, 1498, he was hanged and then burned in the same piazza where he had organized the Bonfire of the Vanities. Girolamo Savonarola, who had spent years demanding that others prove their faith through sacrifice, was ultimately killed because he refused to sacrifice himself when challenged. He who had burned the cultural treasures of Florence was himself burned by the same people he had convinced to destroy their heritage. The irony was noted by contemporary observers, who pointed out that Savonarola had finally participated in a bonfire, just not in the way he had originally planned. From religious extremism, let's move to scientific extremism and meet Marie Curie, though not for her death, which was tragic and heroic rather than absurd. Instead, let's discuss her laboratory assistant, Claude Roux, whose death demonstrated that scientific dedication can sometimes override basic common sense. Roux worked in Curie's laboratory during the early days of radioactivity research, when nobody fully understood the dangers of handling radioactive materials. The health effects of radiation exposure were completely unknown, and researchers routinely handled radium and other radioactive substances with their bare hands. Curie's laboratory was a wonderland of glowing substances and mysterious energies. Radium samples glowed green in the dark, creating an almost magical atmosphere that made the researchers feel like they were working with captured starlight. Roux was particularly fascinated by the aesthetic properties of radioactive materials. He would spend hours after work simply admiring the way radium samples glowed. often keeping them in his pockets so he could enjoy their luminescence during his commute home. He developed the habit of carrying small radium samples with him everywhere, not for scientific purposes, but simply because he found their glow beautiful and calming. Rokes would sit in dark rooms holding pieces of radium, watching the green light dance across his fingers. This wasn't unusual behavior for the time. Many researchers treated radioactive materials as curiosities rather than hazards. Curie herself kept radium samples in her desk drawer and was known to show visitors her collection of glowing elements as if they were gems. But Rokes took this casual approach to radioactivity further than most. He began sleeping with radium samples under his pillow, claiming that their gentle glow helped him relax and fall asleep more easily. He carried larger and larger pieces in his pockets, eventually walking around Paris with enough radioactive material to light up a small room. The radiation exposure gradually destroyed Rokes's health, though he didn't understand what was happening to him. He developed what we now know were classic symptoms of radiation poisoning: fatigue, nausea, hair loss, and skin lesions. But since these symptoms weren't yet connected to radioactivity, Rokes attributed them to stress, poor diet, or simply working too hard. He continued his radioactive nighttime routine, even as his health deteriorated, convinced that the glowing radium was somehow beneficial to his well-being. Rokes died in 1903, not from a laboratory accident or experimental mishap, but from what was essentially a very slow motion case of radiation poisoning caused by his aesthetic appreciation of pretty, glowing death. Claude Rokes became one of the first people in history to be killed by his own scientific curiosity, combined with a complete misunderstanding of the materials he was working with. He died because he found radioactivity beautiful and couldn't resist surrounding himself with it, making him a victim of both scientific ignorance and aesthetic appreciation. Marie Curie, learning from Rokes's death and others like it, eventually developed the safety protocols that prevented similar tragedies, though not before suffering significant radiation exposure herself. Science, she learned, was beautiful but also dangerous, and the two qualities were often inseparable. Let's conclude our journey through history's most absurd deaths with someone who managed to combine multiple forms of stupidity into a single, spectacular finale. Meet Captain Matthew Webb, the first person to swim across the English Channel, and a man who proved that past success is no guarantee against future foolishness. In 1875, Webb achieved international fame by swimming from Dover to Calais in just under 22 hours, becoming a Victorian celebrity and inspiring countless imitators. He was a genuine hero, proof that human determination could overcome natural barriers that had seemed insurmountable. But fame, as Webb discovered, can be a more dangerous opponent than the English Channel. The public demand for increasingly spectacular aquatic feats led Webb to attempt longer and more dangerous swims, each one designed to recapture the attention he had received for his channel crossing. By 1883, Webb was essentially a professional daredevil, attempting swims that were less about athletic achievement and more about public spectacle. He had survived numerous dangerous aquatic challenges, from swimming in rough seas to attempting endurance records in freezing water. His final challenge was swimming the Whirlpool Rapids below Niagara Falls, a stretch of water that had already killed several people who attempted to navigate it. The rapids were notorious for their unpredictable currents, hidden rocks, and water temperatures that could induce hypothermia within minutes. Webb was warned by everyone who knew the area that swimming the rapids was essentially suicide. Local guides told him it was impossible. Other swimmers refused to attempt it. Even the spectators who came to watch thought he was signing his own death warrant. But Webb had convinced himself that his channel, crossing fame, meant he could overcome any aquatic challenge. He believed his reputation was built on achieving the impossible, and he needed to maintain that reputation through increasingly dramatic feats. On July 24, 1883, Webb entered the water above the rapids, confident that his swimming ability and experience would carry him through safely. He had trained for months, studied the currents, and convinced himself that success was simply a matter of determination and technique. He disappeared beneath the surface within minutes, caught in a whirlpool that his swimming skills were completely inadequate to handle. His body was recovered 4 days later, battered beyond recognition by the rocks and currents that had defeated hundreds of previous victims. Matthew Webb, conqueror of the English Channel and master of long-distance swimming, was killed by water that no amount of training or experience could have prepared him for. He had confused fame with invincibility, celebrity with competence, and past success with future survival. His death marked the end of the Victorian era's faith in the power of individual determination to overcome any natural obstacle. Sometimes, it turned out, the obstacle wins, regardless of how famous or accomplished the challenger might be. Webb's story reminds us that throughout history, death has been the ultimate equalizer, the final judge of human ambition and folly. Whether you're an emperor killed by a doorframe, a philosopher suffocated by appreciation, or a champion swimmer defeated by water, the Grim Reaper maintains a sense of humor about human pretensions. These stories of absurd deaths serve as both entertainment and warning. Intelligence, fame, power, and skill are no protection against the fundamental absurdity of existence. Sometimes the universe simply decides that your time is up, and the method of your departure will be so ridiculous that people will still be laughing about it centuries later. In the end, we're all just one poorly timed sneeze, misplaced footstep, or overly enthusiastic laugh away from joining history's catalogue of entertainingly stupid deaths. The best we can do is try to make our exits slightly less amusing than our predecessors, though given the examples we've examined, that might be more difficult than it appears. Death, it seems, will always have the last laugh. We can only hope it finds our particular demise less hilarious than the unfortunate souls we've encountered in this survey of history's most absurdly terminated lives.